This is a viewer's very old system, and in this video I want to talk about upgrade paths. Many of you have asked about upgrade recommendations for viewers who have especially old systems. This one definitely qualifies. We just take a quick glance here, you can see there are some fairly old components, and I'm going to tell you exactly how I would upgrade this system step by step, which parts I would upgrade first, and what I would upgrade to, especially in this current market. Stay with me.
To get rid of that annoying activation watermark, hop on over to VIP STD Key and purchase a Windows 10 Pro OEM key for fractions of the price of retail. Just use a secure payment method like PayPal, receive your key in seconds, and activate your OS here. Bye bye watermark. And be sure to use our new offer code SKGS for a sweet discount.
So it's very apparent that I have not cleaned this system yet. It will be cleaned in the very next episode of the PCDC playlist on this channel, actually the very next video, more than likely, that you'll see here. So this system, I'll go ahead and just run through the specs right up front, has an Athlon X4 860K in it, so that's what, circa 2013, 2014. It has a single 8 gig stick of DDR3 1600 megahertz. It's using a pretty old, fairly small A68, I believe, motherboard. It has an R7 360 2 gig graphics card in it, and a measly 350 watt power supply with cables that barely reach their intended targets. Now, I'm no mathematician, but I'd say this power supply is a bit under wattage for most modern builds. This is actually a pre-built from a company called Cybertron, which I have no idea, I don't even know if it exists anymore. It might not. I would not be surprised if this power supply was the original power supply included in the pre-built. That tends to be how a lot of pre-built companies cut corners. Unfortunately, the power supply is one of the most sacred parts of a build, particularly because it can kill everything else in your system if something goes wrong in here. You don't want to cheap out on these too much. This is definitely a cheap unit, and this would actually be the very first thing that I upgrade. I know that sounds a bit weird because this CPU is dying for an upgrade. This is a very, very old chip. This graphics card is super old as well. You'd think these would be the two logical things to upgrade first. The problem is you're being limited across the board by what you can upgrade to by the power supply. I like to think of power supplies like I think of tires on cars. They're often overlooked by a majority of car owners out there, especially, you know, your average like Toyota Camry commuter, right? Most people aren't thinking, okay, well, it's been about 5-6 years, maybe I should change my tires, you know, probably a life or death situation if a tire explodes on a highway going 60 or 70 miles an hour. It's not a thought, unfortunately, that crosses many people's minds. And that's why you'll see random tires on the sides of highways all the time, because once they get up to temp, or there's a lot of just force being pushed through that tire in question, it will explode. And that could lead to a fairly dangerous accident. Same goes for a power supply. If you don't have a high enough wattage unit, or if the power supply itself is so old and so dirty that it's not able to pump out stable, reliable power efficiently, it could kill your system. I mean, it could wreck your car, right? So this is one of the most overlooked aspects of a build, unfortunately, but it is the first thing I would upgrade because it will give us so much more headroom for additional upgrades down the line. I don't want to increase the horsepower of my car without changing the tires, especially if the tires are old. Kind of, you get what I'm getting at here? Does that make sense at all? So change those tires, folks. I've linked down below a power supply I recommend for this build. Actually, we've got one on order from Corsair specifically for the cleaning video that will involve this system. But anything I would say around 500 to 600 watts, depending on what you're gonna upgrade to, will be fine, especially if you're on a tighter budget. And if it's a modular, semi-modular, or just a completely non-modular power supply, who cares? I mean, ease of use is nice. If you have the extra storage space for additional cables, it's not gonna be a big deal. But that is more or less a subjective thing. At the end of the day, wattage, efficiency, the build quality, the warranty, those are the things you want to keep in mind when shopping for a new power supply. Next up, the next upgrade for this system, apart from maybe the obvious, the case, it depends on if you're a fan of old classic cases like these. This is actually the left side panel of this case. Whoops. It has a fan attached to it, and it is powered by Molex. That tells you anything about how old the system is. But if you can bear with the case, the next thing I'd upgrade is the platform. What I mean by that, the CPU, the motherboard, and the RAM. Unfortunately, this jump requires all three, really. You need a brand new motherboard. You need different RAM because generational leap from DDR3 to DDR4 occurred between this platform and the Ryzen platform that I'd upgrade to. So we're gonna recommend something in the realm of a 2600 to a 3600 Ryzen 5 CPU. I know that seems just like the most obvious cop-out CPU answer out there for tech tubers, but it's true. It's like that for a reason. Ryzen 5 3600s especially are so good for the price. If you can get one around MSRP or even used on eBay for maybe 140 to 160 USD, that'd be awesome. I'd spend about 80 to 100 bucks on a B350 or B450 motherboard. Remember that you're gonna need to update your BIOS to make that Ryzen 5 3600 compatible with the motherboard. And then I'd spend 60 bucks or so on 16 gigs dual channel DDR4, around 3000, 3200 megahertz is typically the sweet spot there. Now my logic for upgrading the CPU over the graphics card is very simple. First off, any major graphics card upgrade is going to be in vain if you're ultimately held back by the CPU. And at the end of the day, we're still probably going to see a fairly healthy frame rate bump from upgrading the CPU. Usually you'd think you upgrade the graphics card, that's where you see the big bump, but we're so limited on both sides of this equation, especially when seen in the context of modern games, that you'll still see a substantial bump by upgrading that CPU to something, again, like a Ryzen 5 2600 or 3600. Now, we've actually got an AIO in here. It's a 120mm AIO. The barbs up thing, I mean, it's not a big deal. A lot of people like to complain, especially after seeing that GN video about how barbs up is bad. Ultimately, if the AIO is constructed properly, if it's filled properly, barbs up is not bad so long as the pump is below the height of the barb, okay? We have a video talking about this, clearing up the misconceptions that arose from that original video. Anyway, this right here, I would recycle. So you could use the stock Ryzen cooler that comes with most 3600s, but at the end of the day, this AIO is gonna run likely a bit quieter. Now, there are people who just hate water cooling in general. They're air-cool fans for life. That's your prerogative. You can do whatever you want with your system. I personally would like to reuse this. I'd clean it up. You're going to see that in the cleaning video. Yeah, I think that because the 3600 is only a 65 watt TDP chip, this 120mm AIO is going to fare just fine. And we can actually keep our fan curves quite conservative as well with that chip under load. And the final two upgrades to consider, the graphics card and more than likely storage. If you have an old system, your operating system is probably loaded on the hard drive. Now look, if you can handle super long boot times, if you can handle the sluggishness of an operating system loaded onto an HDD, be my guest, keep it the way it is, don't waste any more money there. But I would plead with you to at least consider maybe a 500 gig SATA SSD. It could be a 2.5-inch version or an M.2 version. Just make sure your motherboard supports it. If you want to go big, you can go with an NVMe drive. But at the end of the day, anything over an OS being loaded onto a hard drive is going to be a night and day difference when it comes to just day-to-day operations in the operating system. And that'll only cost you maybe 40 bucks, 50 bucks, depending on the size of the SATA drive that you get. I would do that personally before I upgraded the graphics card, okay? This R7 360 here, I'll make do with that, right? As long as I can get something over a hard drive for a boot drive. And that brings us to our final upgrade, the graphics card. I saved the best for last, folks. This market in 2021 is completely jacked up right now. You can check used sites like eBay for GTX 1070s and 1080s, but they're still a bit priced in 2021 when seen in context of the latest Ampere and RDNA 2 offerings from both Team Green and Team Red. I wouldn't go any higher than about a 1660 for now. You can always sell it back and get most of your money and then reinvest that along with additional savings into a better card later on. But for now, I'd say a 1660, especially when paired with something like a Ryzen 5 2600 to 3600, will be just fine. Your power supply is going to be able to handle this combo no problem, and you'll still see significant frame rate gains overall. So for those who are sitting on old hardware, maybe confused about what to upgrade first, hopefully this video has come in very handy. I like to use viewer systems because these are the kinds of systems your average viewer has. Maybe somebody just hasn't upgraded in several years and is curious about what to upgrade first. Again, personally, and I think this is an industry acceptable answer. It's not like out of the blue. Check your power supply. It makes no sense to upgrade anything else if your power supply cannot handle the load demanded. And then I would look to the platform. I'd look to cooling, maybe some aesthetics like the case, then your storage, then your graphics card. Now, some might say, well, I'd change storage first. That's gonna give me a much snappier system. That's perfectly plausible. This is just one way to approach it. But Personally, if I'm going for big upgrades long term, you got to start with the power supply, then you got to move on to the platform. Those two will determine how much more leadway you'll have when it comes to graphics card upgrades and the like later on, cooling upgrades. It all kind of just makes sense once you tackle these two first. If you guys enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. I'd appreciate that. Check out the parts we recommended down below in the video description, and I'll catch you in the next one. My name is Greg. Thanks for learning with me.